It always starts the same way. News trickling in from a region that's long existed on the knife's edge. Kashmir, a name that has become synonymous with conflict, frozen diplomacy, and quiet but ever-present fear. For a brief moment, it seemed like the tension had finally given way to a fragile peace. Indian tourism in the region was booming, local businesses cautiously reopened, and the world's eyes looked elsewhere. But on the morning of April 22nd, 2025, all of that was shattered in seconds. An explosion near the popular town of Pahalgam, which left 26 Indian tourists dead, reminded the world that Kashmir's peace was always temporary, a thin veil pulled over decades of unresolved hostility between two nuclear-armed nations. And now, in a world already destabilized by shifting alliances, economic turmoil, and global uncertainty, India and Pakistan have once again stepped to the edge of something that could change everything. In the wake of the Pahalgam attack, India reacted with the force and speed of a nation both wounded and enraged. Prime Minister Narendra Modi cut short a state visit to Saudi Arabia and returned to New Delhi to face a nation in mourning. His administration didn't hesitate. Within 48 hours, India had suspended visa services for Pakistani citizens, closed the Attari Wagah border crossing, and expelled key Pakistani diplomatic personnel. But what made this different from previous escalations was something far more fundamental, something that had until now remained untouched through war after war. India moved to suspend the Indus Waters Treaty, a 1960 agreement that had governed the distribution of water between India and Pakistan for over 6 decades. This decision stunned the international community. The Indus Waters Treaty, brokered by the World Bank, has survived every major Indo-Pakistani conflict, including full-scale wars in 1965, 1971, and the Kargil conflict of 1999. It's often cited as one of the most successful water-sharing arrangements in the world, even amid extreme hostility. Its suspension isn't just symbolic, it's existential. Pakistan is heavily dependent on the Indus River system, especially for agriculture, drinking water, and hydroelectric energy. In a country already buckling under inflation, political instability, and climate change, a disruption to this water flow could be catastrophic. But here's the twist. While India has declared that not a single drop of water will flow into Pakistan, it currently lacks the full infrastructure to make that declaration reality. Blocking rivers like the Chenab and Jhelum would require years of reservoir construction, canal rerouting, and legal maneuvering. Still, even without physically stopping the water, India's decision to cut off critical hydrological data has already left Pakistan blind to upstream conditions, an information blackout that could mean devastating floods or deadly droughts with zero warning. Pakistan's reaction was swift and predictably severe. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif called the move an act of war, invoking language not heard from Islamabad in years. Pakistan officially suspended the 1972 Simla Agreement, which has been a cornerstone of diplomatic engagement between the two nations. Pakistani airspace was closed to Indian aircraft. All trade was halted, diplomats were expelled, and on the international front, Pakistan turned to the United Nations and the World Bank, demanding emergency arbitration and accusing India of state-sponsored environmental warfare. But Islamabad's options are limited. Its economy is teetering. The IMF has delayed aid disbursements due to political instability, and internal unrest, from Baloch separatists to street-level protests, has sapped the government's ability to mount a unified response. Still, Pakistan has something it knows India must take seriously: a powerful, well-positioned military and a nuclear arsenal built precisely for scenarios like this one. As these political and diplomatic grenades were thrown across borders, actual grenades weren't far behind. Along the line of control in Kashmir, skirmishes began to flare up again. Small arms fire, mortar shells, drone incursions. Indian security forces, already on high alert after the attack, launched sweeping operations through the Kashmir Valley. Suspected insurgents were arrested. Homes believed to house militant operatives were demolished. Surveillance drones buzzed over towns and rural roads. The Indian Army, citing intelligence of future planned attacks, moved elite mountain units closer to the line of control. Pakistan's army responded in kind, mobilizing units from the Rawalpindi Corps, bolstering air defenses, and increasing aerial patrols near sensitive zones. So far, both nations have stopped short of full-blown airstrikes, but the calculus is changing fast. According to Indian intelligence, the group behind the Pahalgam attack, the so-called Resistance Front, is believed to be a proxy for Lashkar-e-Taiba, a Pakistan-based militant group with a long history of violence in Kashmir. Pakistani officials, however, vehemently deny any state involvement, calling for a neutral investigation and accusing India of using the attack as a pretext for crackdowns and water aggression. But in New Delhi, the narrative has already shifted. The attack is seen not just as terrorism, but as a line crossed, a challenge to India's sovereignty, its security, and its right to respond however it sees fit. The rhetoric from Indian media and nationalist politicians has escalated accordingly. TV anchors talk openly of surgical strikes. Columnists debate the logistics of a limited war. Social media feeds fill with satellite images, maps, and hashtags like Number Strike Back and Number Indus Retaliation. But there's something deeper happening beneath this surface-level tit-for-tat. India is testing something. For decades, its approach to Pakistan has been reactive, responding to provocations with measured restraint, always wary of international backlash. But in 2025, India is different. Its economy is surging. Its military modernization is progressing at a rapid pace, with new fighter jets, advanced drones, and domestically produced missile systems ready for deployment. It has growing diplomatic support from the US, Israel, and increasingly, the Gulf states. And it has a population that, after years of border tensions and insurgent attacks, is no longer content with restraint. The suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty is not just a response to a single attack. It's a signal that India is now willing to rewrite the rules of the Indo-Pakistani relationship. No longer bound by decades-old diplomatic taboos, no longer willing to wait for international approval before acting. Pakistan, for its part, is struggling to keep pace. Its army remains one of the most powerful in the Muslim world, and its nuclear deterrent is very real. But its conventional forces are stretched thin across internal counterinsurgency operations. Its economy limits its options, and its reliance on Chinese investment, particularly through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, leaves it vulnerable to international economic pressure. Beijing has so far remained publicly neutral, but Indian intelligence reports suggest back-channel communications urging restraint, more out of economic interest than strategic alignment. Meanwhile, the U.S. has quietly endorsed India's right to self-defense, though stopping short of supporting water treaty suspensions or preemptive military action. All of this makes for a volatile, high-stakes moment, one where small miscalculations, like a misidentified drone or a border skirmish gone wrong, could spiral into full-scale war. And unlike past flare-ups, the tools being used today are new and unpredictable. Cyber warfare, drones, economic coercion, and the weaponization of natural resources like water, something the international legal community is wholly unprepared to deal with. And just when it seemed the situation couldn't grow more unstable, Indian fighter jets were seen flying low over Kupwara, a northern district near the LOC. Social media lit up with blurry footage and sonic booms. Hours later, Pakistan reported explosions in Muzaffarabad, its side of Kashmir, alleging Indian airstrikes on militant camps. India denied targeting civilian or military infrastructure, but confirmed precision operations against terror assets. In retaliation, Pakistani artillery shelled Indian forward posts in Poonch and Rajouri. Both sides now accuse each other of crossing the red line. And that's only the beginning. By the time dawn broke over the jagged Himalayan skyline the next day, the border was anything but quiet. In the pre-dawn mist, columns of Indian Army units moved into forward positions across Kashmir's volatile frontier. Satellite footage, later confirmed by Indian defense sources, showed increased deployment of artillery batteries and BrahMos missile launchers within striking distance of the line of control. Though no official declaration of war had been made, the ground reality told a different story, one where ceasefire agreements signed in the past were now little more than fragile paper shields in the wind. Across the LOC, the Pakistani military was mobilizing as well. Troop movements were reported near Neelam Valley, Gilgit, in Pimber. Pakistan Air Force bases in Sargodha, Murad, and Skardu saw increased activity, with fighter jets scrambling for sorties every few hours, rehearsing defensive and offensive drills alike. Anti-air batteries were repositioned. Military hospitals were placed on alert. Pakistani state media ramped up its rhetoric, framing the current escalation as a prelude to another Indian misadventure, reminiscent of the Balakot airstrike in 2019, but with stakes significantly higher this time. The possibility of a limited war, or even a series of cross-border strikes, was no longer a hypothetical in military planning rooms. Indian officials, speaking on condition of anonymity, admitted that the Prime Minister was briefed on multiple military options. These range from covert ground incursions and airstrikes to the highly risky idea of limited annexations of border villages believed to be launching points for infiltrators. What was new, however, was the language used in these meetings. No longer were Indian defense planners discussing mere retaliation. They were discussing preemptive disruption, strategic dominance, and breaking the cycle of attrition that has defined Indo-Pakistani relations for decades. Pakistan, however, remained confident in its ability to deter escalation. Its doctrine of full-spectrum deterrence, which includes the threat of tactical nuclear weapons in the event of Indian advances, was once again aired on primetime news. Retired generals and political analysts appeared on screens across Islamabad, reminding viewers and adversaries alike that any incursion, however surgical, would invite a disproportionate response. The problem, though, was that both nations now viewed each other through the lens of unpredictability. India saw Pakistan as a state unwilling or unable to control terror groups that operate across the border. Pakistan saw India as a rising power increasingly unconcerned with international norms or traditional red lines. As skirmishes intensified, the diplomatic channels that usually offered de-escalation began to falter. Back-channel communications between intelligence agencies, once a quiet, effective buffer, went silent. The Indian Foreign Ministry dismissed Pakistani requests for third-party mediation, reiterating its stance that Kashmir was an internal matter. Meanwhile, Pakistan's ambassador to the United Nations accused India of violating international law, human rights, and threatening regional stability through its water policy and military actions. The World Bank, custodian of the Indus Waters Treaty, offered to mediate, but New Delhi declined, signaling its intent to renegotiate or reframe the terms entirely. Meanwhile, the human cost of this standoff began to mount. In the villages lining the LOC, civilian life became a daily gamble. School children were kept home, bunkers were reopened, families fled in the middle of the night, often with little more than what they could carry. Shelling from both sides struck homes, livestock, and infrastructure. A hospital in Uri was hit by shrapnel, wounding several staff and patients. On the Pakistani side, the town of Athmukam reported dozens of casualties after Indian artillery reportedly targeted suspected militant movement. Independent verification was nearly impossible. Journalists had been barred from frontline access, and internet blackouts were in place across parts of the Kashmir Valley. The role of insurgents and non-state actors also grew murkier by the hour. The Resistance Front, which had claimed responsibility for the Pahalgam attack, released another statement warning of further attacks if India continued what it called its military occupation of Kashmir. Indian security forces responded with mass raids and detentions across Baramulla, Anantnag, and Kupwara. Reports emerged of civilian protests, curfews, and clashes with paramilitary forces. In Islamabad, these actions were framed as proof of Indian state oppression. In New Delhi, they were portrayed as counter-terrorism efforts in a restive region deliberately destabilized by Pakistan's intelligence services. The media played its part too, on both sides. Indian channels aired round-the-clock coverage of the attack, the military buildup, and speculative animations of missile strikes on Pakistani positions. In Pakistan, talk shows filled with analysts forecasting war, showing historical clips of the Kargil conflict, and claiming India's water strategy amounted to hydro-terrorism. But what alarmed international observers most was the shift in tone among young citizens on both sides. Social media platforms became digital battlegrounds where memes, threats, and misinformation swirled into a frenzy. Support for hardline action on both sides was at a record high. As the crisis escalated, global actors began to take notice. The United States issued a cautious statement urging both nations to de-escalate and respect their existing treaties. The European Union called for restraint and dialogue. Russia, maintaining close ties with both nations, offered to host peace talks in Moscow. China, whose Belt and Road investments pass through Pakistan-administered Kashmir, issued a vague but firm warning about external destabilization of regional projects. But behind closed doors, intelligence leaks suggested that Beijing was more worried about spillover effects in Xinjiang and trade disruption than about water treaties or insurgencies. For India, these reactions only reinforced its belief that the world would not intervene forcefully enough to deter its actions. For Pakistan, it was proof of increasing international indifference to its strategic concerns. And then came the most chilling development yet. Indian satellites detected what appeared to be the forward movement of Pakistani nuclear-capable Shaheen missile units. Though no warheads were armed and no launch sequences were initiated, the mere redeployment of these assets triggered alarm in Indian command centers. India responded by placing portions of its own strategic forces on alert, particularly those under the Strategic Forces Command. The doctrine of no first use remained publicly in place, but within Indian defense circles, conversations about tactical flexibility were now being had, quietly but seriously. By early May, the crisis had entered a state of tense equilibrium, a hot peace, as analysts began to call it. Military assets were deployed, cross-border exchanges were regular, and diplomatic ties were effectively severed. Yet neither side had escalated beyond the threshold of limited engagement. The Indus Waters Treaty remained suspended, but water flow had not yet been physically stopped. Airstrikes were limited to claim terrorist camps, with care taken not to target military infrastructure directly. But this restraint was thin, fraying under the weight of national pride, domestic politics, and the simple truth that both sides had already crossed lines they had never touched before. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the current standoff is that it no longer fits the script of previous Indo-Pakistani conflicts. In the past, there were buffers, international pressure, shared treaties, even the basic fear of mutual destruction. But now those buffers are eroding. India is more confident, more assertive, and more willing to act unilaterally. Pakistan, more isolated, more fragile, and more dependent on its nuclear deterrent, is leaning heavily on its last lines of defense. What's playing out in 2025 isn't just another border dispute. It's the evolution of a 75-year-old rivalry into a new and more dangerous form. One shaped not only by territory and ideology, but by water, technology, perception, and the growing belief that the old rules no longer apply. As India continues to threaten long-term structural changes to the Indus system, such as accelerating dam projects in Himachal Pradesh and Ladakh, and restricting data sharing, Pakistan faces an impossible choice: accept a new reality where India holds the hydrological high ground, or act militarily to prevent what it views as a slow suffocation. It is in this context of irreversible decisions and narrowing exit ramps that the world must now consider the unthinkable. By mid-May 2025, the specter of full-scale war loomed heavier than ever. The images emerging from both sides of the line of control were bleak and harrowing. Columns of smoke snaking into the sky from bombarded villages, evacuations in the dead of night, and rows of silent, anxious civilians queuing at border hospitals. The official death toll had already surpassed 300, with thousands more injured or displaced. Yet neither India nor Pakistan had budged from their hardened stances. Diplomacy was reduced to accusations at international forums, while any talks of de-escalation were dismissed as weakness in the domestic arena. India, bolstered by public opinion and economic leverage, began accelerating what many analysts called its Kashmir Doctrine, a blend of military pressure, civil restructuring, and infrastructural dominance designed to solidify its control over the region and isolate Pakistan's influence. New security zones were erected across the valley, with biometric surveillance, drone patrols, and intensified troop presence. Home demolitions of suspected militants became routine, and neighborhoods were locked down under near martial law conditions. The BJP-led government framed these moves as necessary for national security, claiming they were targeting only those aiding terrorism. But in reality, entire communities felt the weight of state force. At the same time, India pushed forward with aggressive hydrological strategies. The Kishanganga and Ratle Dam projects, long sources of tension, were reactivated with urgent timelines. Construction teams, escorted by armed convoys, worked round the clock under military protection. Indian water officials stopped sharing real-time river data with Pakistan, effectively blinding them to fluctuations that could result in flash floods or water shortages. While technically not a breach of the Indus Waters Treaty spirit, since the treaty itself had been suspended, it was a calculated move to demonstrate capability and resolve. Modi's cabinet made no apologies. India, they declared, had waited too long to defend its own people and resources. Pakistan, on the other hand, was experiencing the strain of an escalating conflict on multiple fronts. Internally, the country was buckling under inflation, currency devaluation, and political infighting. The military, long the country's most stable institution, now found itself stretched thin. Not just defending borders, but maintaining order across fractious provinces like Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where separatist unrest had also begun to flare. Still, Pakistan's response was not passive. The Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, launched a covert counter-campaign, funneling support to insurgent networks in Kashmir and ramping up cyber operations targeting Indian infrastructure. Several major Indian government websites were brought down temporarily in a wave of cyber attacks in early May, claimed by groups linked to Pakistani intelligence fronts. The message was clear. Even if outgunned in conventional warfare, Pakistan would retaliate asymmetrically. The danger of miscalculation was now palpable. On May 14th, a Pakistani anti-air battery mistakenly locked onto an Indian reconnaissance drone flying near the line of control. In response, Indian Air Force jets scrambled from bases in Pathankot and Srinagar, violating Pakistani airspace for a brief window before retreating. Both sides blamed each other for the breach. In the confusion, one Indian MiG-29 reportedly crashed near Rajouri, with the pilot presumed captured. The Indian media erupted with fury, calling for a firm military response. In Islamabad, a televised address by Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif warned that any aggression would be met with total and irrevocable retaliation. Within hours, Pakistani missile batteries were placed on high alert. Meanwhile, nuclear rhetoric began to inch from unthinkable to imaginable, not in bombastic announcements, but in the more sinister language of strategic ambiguity. A leaked Indian military document hinted at changes to its nuclear posture, stating that forceful preemption may be considered in response to imminent asymmetric threats. On the Pakistani side, a statement from the Army Strategic Plans Division reiterated that Pakistan retains the right to defend its sovereignty through any means, at any time, under any circumstance. The world listened and shuddered. In Washington, London, and Brussels, policymakers scrambled to formulate responses. Urgent meetings of the UN Security Council were convened, but led nowhere. China, balancing its economic interest with both countries, issued yet another vague call for stability. But behind the scenes, Chinese forces in the Tibet Autonomous Region and along the disputed Doklam Plateau also began quiet repositioning, raising the alarming possibility of a three-front crisis. The United States dispatched a high-level envoy to both New Delhi and Islamabad, but even America's leverage appeared diminished. India, increasingly assertive, felt it could weather global disapproval thanks to its economic clout and growing ties with the West. Pakistan, sensing its isolation, doubled down on its reliance on China and the Gulf states for diplomatic and financial cover. But in the haze of geopolitics and brinkmanship, the human toll remained the starkest. In Muzaffarabad, a Pakistani-administered city, a refugee camp housed thousands who had fled cross-border artillery fire. Children coughed in tents as medical staff struggled with dwindling supplies. On the Indian side, in Pulwama, a convoy of civilian vehicles was hit by an improvised explosive device, killing 12 and reigniting the security dilemma. How can India hold Kashmir without alienating its people? How can Pakistan claim moral high ground while tolerating extremist elements on its soil? Then came a sudden development, a terrorist attack not in Kashmir, but in Mumbai. On May 19th, A coordinated bombing at Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus killed 53 and injured over 200. The attackers, later identified through intercepted communications, were linked to Lashkar-e-Taiba operatives working from Karachi. The Indian government, shaken but furious, convened an emergency session of the National Security Council. Modi, flanked by top military brass, authorized a set of rapid retaliatory measures. The next day, Indian jets struck multiple targets in Pakistan-administered Kashmir, claiming to hit terror camps with precision-guided bombs. The Pakistani government denied any terror infrastructure was present, accusing India of bombing civilian areas. The risk of a broader war was now real. Both militaries moved to DEFCON-like readiness. Pakistan mobilized reserve units. India placed its navy on high alert in the Arabian Sea. Submarines carrying nuclear-capable missiles were reported to have left port. International air travel over northern India and central Pakistan was suspended, causing panic in financial markets across Asia. Oil prices surged. The Indian rupee slid. Pakistani bond markets froze. The world held its breath. And yet it was not bullets or bombs that finally paused the escalation, but a back-channel breakthrough. Sources close to Qatari and Turkish diplomats revealed that a secret trilateral mediation effort involving neutral military negotiators from Switzerland and Sweden had created the outlines of a temporary ceasefire agreement. Neither side would acknowledge the agreement publicly, but within 48 hours of the Mumbai attack, the artillery strikes slowed. Warplanes returned to base. Field commanders on both sides received quiet orders to hold fire unless directly attacked. For now, the abyss was avoided. But make no mistake, the situation was far from resolved. The Indus Waters Treaty remained suspended. Pakistani civilian and military leaders refused to return to the table until India restored water cooperation. India, for its part, demanded proof of Pakistan dismantling all insurgent networks operating across the border. No such proof was forthcoming. Both governments, locked in a political and ideological struggle decades in the making, used the ceasefire to rearm, not reconcile. Kashmir remained on edge. The local population, bearing the brunt of every escalation, saw no relief. Schools remained shut. Militancy, though reduced in visibility, festered underground. Security forces continued operations. Protests flared, only to be crushed. A new generation of Kashmiris grew up knowing nothing but checkpoints, drone surveillance, and martial law. To them, the conflict was not an event, it was the air they breathed. What the world had witnessed in 2025 was not merely a flare-up, but a glimpse into a darker future. One where the old treaties, Simla, Indus, Tashkent, were no longer sacred. One where national pride outweighed international norms. One where two nuclear-armed states could edge terrifyingly close to oblivion, pulled back not by moral clarity or diplomatic grace, but by raw fear of mutual destruction. The final lesson from this crisis may be the simplest yet most sobering of all. That when the last bridge of trust between two enemies collapses, it is not war that begins. It is a descent into permanent instability, where every season brings a new provocation, every skirmish risks escalation, and every act of restraint feels like a coin toss against the abyss. And in that volatile space between peace and war, India and Pakistan continue to circle one another. Not because they want to, but because after 75 years, neither nation remembers how to stop.